entitled The Middle East and Ukraine, Peace or War. So, if you're like me, I can't remember a time since I became aware of what was going on in the world that there wasn't something going on in the Middle East that was a conflict. There was the 7-Day War, then there was the prisoners, the Iraq Revolution, and then we had the Gulf War, and then we invaded Iraq, and then we were in Afghanistan. Now it's ISIL. Something's going on in the Middle East all the time. So we have a chance, there's at least a spark of hope with respect to the Iran situation, that the 5+1 powers have negotiated a possible solution to the development of nuclear weapons by Iran. And there is strong opposition that you have read about from members of Congress, from the Israeli lobbyists, and others. So what is the outfall of that? Should Congress nix that plan? What does that mean for the Middle East? Are we on the verge of another war? Because currently, we're engaged in Afghanistan. There's still war going on there. We have 10,000 troops there. In Iraq, we have 3,000 troops plus bombers. In Syria, bombers. In Yemen, drones. And we continue to enable the Israeli military occupation and apartheid through economic and diplomatic protections. So, powerful forces in the U.S. are still at work to make sure this happens. And the United States, in the last 10 years, has not been adverse to using torture, targeted killing with drones off the battlefield, all illegal, in violation of international law, and yet that is the path that we have chosen to take. So, we need a new Middle East policy. How do we develop that? How does what's happening in the Middle East and the failure to get a treaty or a Congress to support the Iran deal, what does that affect our relationship with other nations? What has the use of drones, the resentment that has built up from the killing of innocent civilians, going to do to our relations with those in the Middle East? So we're going to look at those issues. We're also going to then shift gears a little bit, and we're going to move over to Russia and Ukraine. And we're going to, on the 70th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have the two most powerfully armed nuclear nations in the world, the United States and Russia, in a standoff over in the Ukraine, eyeball to eyeball. How did we get into this situation? And how do we extract ourselves out of there without the chance of blowing up the world? So those are important questions, the Middle East, Russia, and Ukraine. So we're very fortunate today to help us to look into those issues and help us try to understand and maybe come up with some possible avenues out. I have three distinguished panelists that I want to introduce to you, and I'm very proud to say that all three of the panelists are on the Veterans for Peace Advisory Board. So Ray McGovern is going to talk about the issues related to Ukraine and Russia and the United States. And as I think everybody here probably knows Ray, but for those who don't, he's a retired CIA officer turned peace and political activist. He was the CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990. In the 1980s, he chaired the National Intelligence Estimate and prepared the President's Daily Brief. He is an Army veteran and, in addition to being on an advisory board, is a member of Veterans for Peace. Phyllis Bennis and Marjorie Cohn will talk about the issues in the Middle East. Phyllis directs the new internationalism project at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's also a fellow at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She's a writer, analyst, and activist in Middle East and UN issues for many years, and remains on the advisory board of the U.S. campaign to Israeli occupation. And I want to recommend to you her new book, just hot off the press, Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror by her. This will be available after the talk. You can get a copy, have her sign a copy of it. It's going to be available to you. So next, we'll look at the issues of drones through the eyes of Marjorie Cohen. Marjorie is a law professor here in San Diego at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law, where she teaches criminal law, procedure, evidence, and international human rights law. She has lectured throughout the world on human rights issues and U.S. foreign policy. Her most recent book that has just come out this year that's also going to be available. It's called Drones and Targeted Killings, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues. This book here will be available after the presentation today, so you'll have an opportunity to get both books, and I recommend it if you do. I've had a chance to read this book already. So let's begin. Phyllis Bennis will start us off on the Middle East.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, all of you. Good morning. Great to be with you. Can I move this thing? This is a very strange podium for any of you who haven't been up here yet. Okay. So, I want to say first, before I say anything about the Middle East, I want to say something about VFP. This is such an important organization. You all know that because you're part of it and you know the amazing work that it does. But for somebody who's not a veteran of the military, but is sort of a veteran of the anti-military, if you will, I can't tell you how important it is that our allies include organizations like Veterans for Peace, like Iraq Veterans Against the War, like Military Families Speak Out. The question of experience, the question of credibility is crucial, and that's what you all bring to the table. And it's also a legacy. You know, looking around the room, I'm seeing mainly, not only, but mainly veterans of Vietnam. That was my first introduction to the anti-war movement. And I'm afraid that without you, we would have forgotten in the anti-war movement that anti-war mobilization did not start with Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's huge, and the role that you play is so, so important. So thank you. Thank you all for what you do. Now, we're in a sort of amazing week of anniversaries. I mean, it's also kind of amazing because, you know, last night was, I'm not going to talk about those people, but I am going to talk about it was the last one of Jon Stewart. I mean, how crummy is that? I don't know how many of you watched it, but it was really powerful. And Bruce Springsteen at the end, it was awesome. It was absolutely awesome. But this week is also an amazing set of anniversaries. The 70th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when we talk about non-proliferation, as people in my city, in Washington, like to do, we have to remember non-proliferation is not the same as disarmament. We need disarmament. We don't just need non-proliferation. We need to get rid of the nuclear weapons that exist, and that's the lesson that I think we have to take of this 70th anniversary. And it's the anniversary, the first anniversary, of the U.S. beginning of its latest iteration of the global war on terror, known as the war against ISIS. Now, you know, most of you, that President Obama, when he first came into office, he said, you know, he came into office to end the U.S. war in Iraq. He said it was a dumb war. Boy, was he right. And 3 years later, grudgingly, slowly, he did pull out all the U.S. troops out of Iraq. It was on the same basis that had been negotiated by George Bush, but nonetheless it was implemented by Barack Obama. That's a good thing. However, 2 years later, troops are back. We have somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 pairs of boots on the ground. After all the talk about no boots on the ground, we don't know how many pairs of sneakers from, you know, the special forces, the CIA, whatever, that we don't know about. But the boots on the ground are somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 pairs. And we have bombers and we have drones. And in the latest report that came out last week, some of you may have seen it already, from Air Wars, the Air Wars organization in the UK, out of the 5,700 or so airstrikes that the US has carried out during that year, they examined just about 52 of those airstrikes and found that there were somewhere between 450 and 1,500 civilian casualties. Civilians. And this is from the attacks that we're being told are the most precise and the most technically accurate in history. Yeah, that's probably true. And what's your point? That these are not B-52s that are killing thousands with each airstrike? Well, okay. that it's only 450 and we're supposed to be happy about that? We got a lot of work to do. These are 459 at a minimum, civilians of whom 100 at a minimum were children that were being killed. This is not okay. The fact that others may do it worse cannot be the standard by which we judge the legitimacy of any act of military force. There is a massive war underway in the Middle East. You remember also when President Obama came in, he said, we don't really want to use this term, the global war on terror, GWAT. This was always my favorite acronym because it kind of sounds evil, GWAT. Right? It sounds like what it is. But, so he said, well, we're not going to call it that. We're going to call it overseas contingency operations. Oh, okay. So it sounds very sort of precise and clinical and no consequence, right? This is a GWAT. It's different. It's not the same as George Bush's GWAT. This is President Obama's GWAT. Relies a lot more on drones. But he's bombing 7 countries instead of George Bush's 3. I don't know if we want to think that that's much better. You know, the pressures to go to war in this country are huge. And the pressures are extremely heavy on President Obama. I don't want to minimize the kinds of pressures that he faces every day from people who say, you must go to war. If you look back 2 years ago, there was the threat, for the first time, of the US bombing Syria. And with a lot of help from the British people, and ultimately the British Parliament, and then a face-saving offer from the Russian president, our mobilization in the US, which was a concentrated, all-hands-on-deck effort over just 6 weeks, where calls to the members of Congress were running at, they told us, 900 to 1 against war. It worked. And we stopped it. It was an extraordinary victory. And it lasted 1 year. A year later, the bombing began. But that doesn't mean that our effort was defeated. We had 1 year where the US was not bombing Syria. That's huge. And it showed we could do it. It showed that in the era of Barack Obama's presidency, when it's been much more difficult to mobilize the anti-war forces of this country, that we still could. We could still be part of the global movement. The global movement, and again, looking around the room, I know most of you were out in the streets on February 15th, 2003, the day the world said no to war. Let me see your hands. How many of you were out on the street that day? Everybody. Everybody was on the streets that day. And you know, after those protests in more than 800 cities around the world, in more than 70 countries, in every continent, including Antarctica, the war went ahead anyway. And a lot of people threw up their hands and said, you know, it just doesn't matter. Our political system is so broken that it doesn't matter what we do. We may as well not even bother. We may as well give up and go home because we had millions of people in the streets. We had, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, somewhere between 12 and 14 million people on one day with the same call. The world says no to war in hundreds of languages around the world. And people said, but we failed. I don't think so. I don't think we failed. We were unable to stop that war. That's true. And that was the single most important goal of that protest. But it wasn't the only goal. And on other goals, we succeeded massively. We showed the world there could be a global protest. That had never happened before. Now we take it for granted. In 2003, this was a shocking idea. And we pulled it off. We showed the world that there would be a political price to pay to go to war in the face of massive opposition. And I would submit that the reason that George Bush did not go to war against Iran when he threatened to in 2007 was because of the protests of 2003. We raised the price of war. And that's why the work of Veterans for Peace, the work of all our allies, has to continue. Because we have to keep raising the price of war. So that when we have the crisis du jour, today's crisis is Iran. Today's crisis is to make sure that Congress does not kill, as they are trying, does not kill this incredible diplomatic victory, a massive victory for diplomacy over war. That's what this deal represents. It's not a great deal, let's be clear. It doesn't say a word about the existing nuclear weapons in the region. The one country that does have nuclear weapons, which as you all know is not Iran, it's Israel. Israel has somewhere between 300 and 400 high-density nuclear bombs that have been destabilizing the region since they were exposed to the world by Mordechai Vanunu back in 1983. Destabilizing the region, causing arms races across the region. And yet, the chutzpah of the Israeli prime minister to be claiming, number one, it's all about us. There's a reason Israel wasn't at the table. They are a nuclear weapons state in defiance of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So yeah, non-proliferation is important. I don't want any more nuclear weapons anywhere in the world. I don't want nuclear power anywhere in the world. But you can't go on forever having non-proliferation if you don't deal with the existing nuclear weapons. So that means, yeah, we need a nuclear weapons-free zone across the Middle East, no exceptions, starting with the ones that exist in Israel. But we also need a nuclear weapons-free North America. We need to get rid of the nuclear weapons in our country because it's been our country that has used nuclear weapons. There are 9 nuclear weapons states right now. Only one has ever used them, and it was our government. So we have to take the responsibility to create a nuclear weapons-free world. We can start in the Middle East, but we need to go much further than that. But in the meantime, in the real world of what's possible today is diplomacy, not war, to resolve the nuclear crisis with Iran. That's a great thing. That's a great thing. It's hard for me to imagine that I'm actually agreeing with President Obama on something. But I gotta tell you on this one, he's absolutely right. This is the diplomacy that was possible. All of these calls, we want a deal. We want a diplomatic deal. We're not saying no diplomacy. We're not saying no deal. We just want a better deal. Oh, okay. And what's the deal that you want? We want Iran to surrender. Oh, okay, that's gonna happen. So, okay, well then let's just go back and start negotiating again. Well, sorry, that boat has sailed. There's nobody left in Vienna. They all went home. The negotiations are over. It's done. This is the deal. So you either accept this deal or you're supporting war. That's what we have to be focused on today. You know, we hear very often, we hear it about Israel-Palestine all the time. No one wants war. That's not true. No one profits from war. That's way not true. You all know this one better than most. You know, a colleague of mine at IPS every year does this great report on CEO pay. The new one just came out. But every year it looks at the, the horror of how much money CEOs make in this country and what it means for workers, what it means for the environment. And a couple of years ago, she did one on what it means for war. To look at the war profiteers and their salaries. I'm just going to give you one example. This was a guy named David Brooks. He was the CEO of what had been a very small company called DHB Industries. They made, among other things, bulletproof vests. And he was making a good salary. This is a rich guy. He was making $500,000 a year. And then came 9/11. And then came 9/12. Because if you remember, the world didn't change on 9/11, the day that we were subjected to a huge crime against humanity. The world changed on 9/12, the day that President Bush announced that the response to that huge crime was going to be that we would take the world to war. That was the day that changed the world. And from that day, between 2003, when the big war, not the smaller war in Afghanistan, not small if you were Afghan, but smaller if you were from the US, the day that the bigger war in Iraq was launched, until 2007, the salary of this very rich guy, David Brooks, went from that $500,000 up to $70 million. He got, and I have to look at my notes for this because it's one of those numbers you can't quite remember. He got a 13,349% raise between 2001 and 2004. And it turned out that his so-called body armor didn't work. It was the bad stuff. Some of you may know people in the military who experienced it. Some of you may have had sons or daughters or sisters or brothers in the military who experienced the fact that their body armor didn't stop a bullet. 5,000 of those vests were recalled in 2005. And what happened? Nothing happened. By the time the armored vests were recalled, he had been paid off with $250 million. Now, a few years later, thankfully, he did go to jail. Not for long, but he did. But this is what it means to talk about who profits from war. There's enormous profits to be made. And that's the hardest part. That's the hardest part. When we look at this immediate crisis that we face right now, and I would urge you all to go back to doing the boring, seemingly useless stuff that we all hate, calling your member of Congress, writing letters to the editor, because you know they're not going to publish your letter to the editor. They're not going to publish the second one either, or the third. But the 13th, they're going to publish. And the problem is there's no shortcuts. You can't sit down one day and say, I'm going to write the 13th letter to the editor. No, you have to write the first 12 first. And it sucks, because you're really trying hard and spending time that you could be doing other things. But if you don't, you don't. So we've got to go back. This month, members of Congress are back in their districts. We've got to be meeting with them, bird-dogging their public events. You just heard from, what's his name, Senator Schumer last night, Senator AIPAC, Senator whatever you want to call him, who just announced that he's against this deal. He's now officially in support of war rather than diplomacy when it comes to Iran. He's in New York. But you know what? He's a powerful senator that's on track to become the next Senate leader of the Democratic Party. So anybody in this country has something to say to him. And we all should be saying it loud and clear. But there's something else. We have to look at the question of the need for arms embargoes. And this is the hardest thing of all. In my book, this great book that you should all go out and read, that just came out. Thank you, Marjorie. I didn't pay her to do that. And it's done as frequently asked questions. And in the second to the last question is, so what should our policy be with an organization that's so violent like ISIS? Don't you need some kind of military strategy? What's the diplomacy that could possibly work? And I go through 8 things that the U.S. should be doing. And the first 2 have to do, well, the first one starts with do no harm. Stop making everything worse. So make it real when you say no boots on the ground, and withdraw them. Make it real when you say there is no military solution. Stop the bombing. You know, that's another thing Obama's right about. There is no military solution. He says it over and over again. And every time he says it, I want to say, excuse me, Mr. President, excuse me, over here. Why don't you do that instead of just talking about it? He's absolutely right. There is no military solution. Every bomb that the U.S. drops in Iraq, imagine, you know, here, say they got it right. Say it's one of the rare times that they dropped it on what was absolutely known to be an ISIS hideout. Everybody that was killed was an ISIS fighter, and no civilians were killed. Now, that has not yet happened in the real world, but let's pretend. Let's pretend that this just happened. And the response here is, yay, we got the bad guys. And if you're an Iraqi Sunni, the response is, there they go, once again. The U.S. is acting as the Air Force for the Shia and the Kurds against the Sunni. Why do they think this is going to make things any better? Because those guys in ISIS, they may or may not be willing to negotiate about anything in particular. We don't know. But we do know they have mothers and fathers and sons and daughters and family members and friends and schoolmates and people from their village and people from their tribe and people who believe the same things they believe, who see their killing as murder. And of those people who get really, really angry, some of them are also going to pick up weapons and come after those they believe accurately are responsible for their death. So if you're serious about stopping terrorism, and God knows we should be because we are responsible for more of it than any other force in the world, both our own and forces that we have created, we do have an obligation to fight against terrorism. And that means we've got to figure out real ways of doing it. It starts with negotiations. It starts with diplomacy. And people come back and say, diplomacy? You can't argue with ISIS. Well, maybe that's true. I don't know. Maybe we won't be able to negotiate directly with ISIS, but we can sure as hell negotiate with the people that are funding them. We can sure as hell negotiate with people who are enabling them to cross borders. We can certainly put the kind of pressure on oil companies, if we have the political will, who are buying the oil that's now controlled by ISIS, that's enabling them to offer higher salaries to their militants than all the other militant organizations in Iraq and Syria, which is the reason why half their members are joining, because they have a guaranteed salary. So we have to be really, really strategic about this. And it comes then back to, what does this have to do with the weapons and an arms embargo? How can you talk about an arms embargo? Well, the US talks about it all the time. It demands that Russia and Iran stop arming the regime in Damascus, stop arming the regime of the Syrian government, of Bashar al-Assad. I agree with that. I think it's a terrible regime, and I think they should stop arming them today. But do I think that the US government has any credibility when it demands that they stop arming one side of a civil war, while the US is arming and allowing its arms to be used to arm the other side? I don't think so. So that's why we have to start talking about the need for an arms embargo. The Syrian civil war, which is somewhat of a misnomer because it is at this moment at least 8 separate civil wars. In the book I said 7. Then Turkey entered the fray officially in a whole other way. It's now at least 8 separate wars that are underway. And all of them are being fought to the last Syrian. Now some of them overlap. You have regional wars. You have a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia being fought out in Syria over who's going to be the biggest regional power. You also have a sectarian war between Sunni and Shia, also between mainly Iran and Saudi Arabia, also being fought out in Syria, over whether Sunni or Shia Islam is going to dominate the region. You have huge contradictions here. You have a war between the US and Russia over things like sea lanes and ports and that sort of thing. We have to be very, very conscious about the complications of these wars. But at the end of the day, we have to look at the origins of these wars in the US war in Iraq. ISIS was not created because Barack Obama withdrew the troops from Iraq. ISIS was created in 2004 to challenge, to fight against the US troops that George W. Bush sent to invade Iraq. That's the origins of ISIS. It's changed its name, it's changed its character, but that's the origins. And until we acknowledge that, we don't have a chance to stop it. So we are looking at a scenario where the whole battlefield is based on an illegal war. The whole battlefield today is illegal. There's no permission in international law for the US to be bombing Syria, to be bombing Iraq. There's an argument you could make that, well, it's derivative self-defense because the Iraqi Prime Minister asked the US to go in and bomb. Well, okay, except for the small fact that the Iraqi Prime Minister is representing a pretty illegitimate government right now. And besides that, governments don't have the right to go bombing their own countries, let alone ask some other country to come in and do it for them. So if we're serious about ending the wars, and we need to be, we have to look at international law. We have to look at the violations of international law, particularly the violations that our own country is carrying out. And we have to prevent it from going further. We have to prevent it from continuing. The cost is simply too high. So as we work desperately hard in the next, I think we're down to about 49, 48 days left before the deadline by which the US Congress has asserted for itself the right to kill the deal that could prevent another useless, illegal, deadly war in the Middle East. We have to be concentrating on that for those 49 days, pressuring, doing whatever is necessary, calling members of Congress, sitting in at their offices, calling their staff, going to their public events, demanding that they hold more public events. There's a new call from our friends at MoveOn.com that just came out. They're calling for a boycott of any Democratic Party fundraising. Don't send any money to the Democratic Party or any Democratic candidate until they come out supporting diplomacy instead of war. Money is what talks. And when we can use money, we should. But it isn't only money, because we don't have as much money as they do. We need to use our bodies, our pressure, our words, our actions. It's what VFP has done for so long, and we need to keep doing it. Thank you for all that you do.
Thanks, Phyllis. What a inspiring, terrific talk. So we're ready to go, right?
Yeah.
Well, we're not done. We're going to now move on to the more directly to the issues related to drones. Marjorie Cohn, who has written that book on drones and targeted killing. Marjorie, you're up next.
Thank you so much. And by the way, this is a collection, and Phyllis has a very, very compelling chapter in it, which is a good reason to buy the book. It's a great honor for me to be here, to be at any VFP convention, and I've been at several of them, and to be a member of the advisory board. My husband is a longtime member of VFP. My father, who died recently, was a longtime member of VFP. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And many people here are veterans of the Vietnam War. I myself am a veteran of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And speaking of the Vietnam War, there's another anniversary that I want to note and add to the list that Phyllis listed, and that is Monday is the 54th anniversary of the beginning of the spraying of Agent Orange all over Vietnam. And I work with the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, which is going to have a workshop this afternoon, and I urge you all to come. It's very important. We've got legislation now to get compensation for the intended victims of Agent Orange, which are the Vietnamese, but also to get more compensation for U.S. veterans who still suffer the effects, and their progeny suffer the effects of Agent Orange. Now, how many of you have seen the movie Good Kill? Good Kill. Yeah, probably out of this whole room of hundreds of people, I saw maybe 4 or 5 hands. Ethan Hawke and January Jones are featured in this film. So why haven't more of us seen it? Why hasn't it been in all the theaters? I don't know why, but I suspect it's because it's so heavy. It's the story of a pilot, and these are pilots who are 7,500 miles from their target. A pilot in Nevada who falls into post-traumatic stress disorder because of what he's asked to do, because of pressing the button where he sees the faces of the victims and then they die. And there's a 10-second lag between the pressing of the button and the dropping of the bomb. And in that 10 seconds, oftentimes, and you can see this in the movie, a woman and child could walk into the area and be blown to bits. And the title Good Kill comes from what other people say who are in that trailer with the pilot after the bomb is dropped and they see what the damage has been. Then they say, good kill, good kill. So if you see this film, it's really important to get it out there, because this is an American who goes home to his family every night, who has a beautiful, lovely wife, lovely children, January Jones, and yet this is what happens to him, and it's very, very, very effective. Now, I'm going to draw largely on my part of the book, A Frightening New Way of War, and then make some other comments talking about drones and targeted killing. In his 2009 acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize, President Barack Obama declared, and this is when I quote, I'm going to go like this, "Where force is necessary, we have a moral and strategic interest in binding ourselves to certain rules of conduct. And even as we confront a vicious adversary that abides by no rules, I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war." By the time Obama accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, 1 year into his presidency, he had ordered more drone strikes than George W. Bush had authorized during his 2 presidential terms. The Bush administration detained and tortured suspected terrorists. The Obama administration has chosen to illegally assassinate them, often with the use of drones. The continued indefinite detention of men at Guantanamo belies Obama's pledge, 2 days after his first inauguration, to close the prison camp there. However, Obama has added only 1 detainee to the Guantanamo roster. The government has decided that instead of detaining members of Al-Qaeda at Guantanamo, they are going to kill them, according to John Bellinger, who formulated the Bush administration's drone policy. On Terror Tuesdays, Obama and John Brennan, his former counterterrorism advisor, now CIA director, go through the kill list to identify which individual should be assassinated that week. The Obama administration has developed a creative method to count the civilian casualties from these assassinations. All military-age men killed in a drone strike zone are considered to be combatants unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. Obama orders 2 different types of strikes: personality strikes, which target individual suspected terrorists, and signature strikes, which don't target individuals, they target areas of suspicious activity. So many times, the Obama administration doesn't even know who it's killing when it mounts a signature strike. Joe Becker and Scott Shane, who wrote in the New York Times, and they're the ones who first talked to reveal this kill list and the Terror Tuesdays, they said, some State Department officials have complained to the White House that the criteria used by the CIA for identifying a terrorist's signature were too lax. The joke was that when the CIA sees 3 guys doing jumping jacks, the agency thinks it's a terrorist training camp. Men loading a truck with fertilizer could be bomb makers, but they also might be farmers. Obama has extended his battlefield beyond Iraq and Afghanistan to Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and Syria, even though the United States is not at war with those countries. Armed drones are operated by pilots located thousands of miles from their targets. Before launching its payload, the drone hovers above the area. It emits a buzzing sound that terrorizes communities. The drones were terrifying, observed New York Times journalist David Rhodey, who was captured by the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2008 and later escaped. From the ground, it is impossible to determine who or what they are tracking as they circle overhead. The buzz of a distant propeller is a constant reminder of imminent death. Drones fire missiles that travel faster than the speed of sound. A drone's victim never hears the missile that kills him. After the drone drops a bomb on its target, a second strike often bombs the rescuers coming in to rescue the wounded. This is called a double tap, but it should really be called a triple tap, because then our government bombs mourners at the funeral that is held for the people who died from the first and second strikes. Obama's administration has killed more people in targeted killing, many of them with drones, than died on 9/11. But of the estimated 4,500 people killed by drones, the vast majority were neither al-Qaeda nor Taliban leaders. In fact, it's estimated that only about 2% were high-level terrorist leaders. Instead, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, most were low-level, anonymous, suspected militants who were predominantly engaged in insurgent or terrorist operations against their own governments, rather than in active international terrorist plots. So when the administration says, well, Pakistan gives us their consent to come in and drop these bombs from drones, yes, they give consent while speaking out of both sides of their mouths. So they complain, our sovereignty's been invaded, you shouldn't be killing our civilians, but then a wink and a nod to dropping the bombs, as long as we kill the enemies of the Pakistani government. And also, consent of a government to an illegal killing does not make it legal. So that's a spurious argument. Although more than 95% of all non-battlefield targeted killings have been carried out by drones, the killer robots are not the only medium used to conduct targeted killings. The United States also employs Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, to conduct raids, as well as AC-130 gunships and cruise missiles launched offshore by air or sea. Drones are Obama's weapon of choice because, unlike piloted fighter aircraft, they don't jeopardize the lives of U.S. pilots. Although many U.S. pilots are getting PTSD, drone pilots who are in Nevada or upstate New York, PTSD, and so they're offering huge bonuses. They can't get enough drone pilots, and they've actually cut back somewhat on the drone program because they can't get enough pilots. There are claims that the use of drones result in fewer civilian casualties than manned bombers. However, a study based on classified military data conducted by the Center for Naval Analyses and the Center for Civilians in Conflict found that the use of drones in Afghanistan has caused 10 times more civilian deaths than manned fighter aircraft. In the United States, the dominant narrative about the use of drones in Pakistan is of a surgically precise and effective tool that makes the U.S. safer by enabling targeted killing of terrorists with minimal downsides or collateral impacts. This narrative is false, according to the comprehensive report Living Under Drones issued by the Stanford Law School and the NYU Law School. Many killed by drones are civilians, or in the administration's parlance, bug splat, referring to the collateral damage estimate methodology the U.S. military and the CIA employ. Targeted killings with drones is counterproductive. General Stanley McChrystal, architect of U.S. counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, declared that drones are hated on a visceral level and contribute to a perception of American arrogance. Mullah Zabara, a southern tribal sheikh from Yemen, told Jeremy Scahill, the U.S. sees al-Qaeda as terrorism, and we consider the drones terrorism. The drones are flying day and night, frightening women and children, disturbing sleeping people. This is terrorism. Drone strikes breed resentment against the United States and lead to the recruitment of more terrorists. Drones have replaced Guantanamo as the recruiting tool of choice for militants, according to Becker and Shane. They quoted Faisal Shahzad, who, while pleading guilty to trying to detonate a bomb at Times Square, told the judge, when the drones hit, they don't see children. Targeted killing, which is just the death penalty without due process, according to attorney Clive Stafford Smith, is an example of American exceptionalism, which reflects the view that people in the United States are somehow superior to those in other countries. In his 2013 speech to the UN General Assembly, Obama said, "Some may disagree, but I believe that America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness through the sacrifice of blood and treasure to stand up not only for our own interests, our own narrow self-interest, but for the interests of all." But in addition to the U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, Hundreds of thousands of people, some say 1 million, have been killed and untold numbers wounded. And Obama frequently refers to us as exceptional. He did that in his State of the Union address this year. And you notice that at the end of his speech, and this was true of his predecessor as well, God bless the United States of America. What about the rest of the people in the world? Is God going to bless them as well? Time columnist Joe Klein, considered by many to be a liberal, bought into American exceptionalism in a disturbing way in a 2012 interview by Joe Scarborough on MSNBC's Morning Joe. Scarborough observed, "You have 14-year-old girls being blown to bits because we have a policy that says, you know what, instead of trying to go in, take the risk, get the terrorists out of hiding, we're just going to blow everything up around them." And he mentioned collateral damage. Klein retorted, "The bottom line in the end is, whose 4-year-old gets killed? What we're doing is limiting the possibility that 4-year-olds here are going to get killed by indiscriminate acts of terror. So it's preferable that foreign little girls get killed by indiscriminate acts of terror, apparently." American exceptionalism also reared its head after the February 2013 leak of a Department of Justice white paper that described circumstances under which the president could order the targeted killing of U.S. citizens. There had been little public concern in the United States about drone strikes killing people in other countries. But when it was revealed that U.S. citizens might be targeted, Americans were outraged, and Rand Paul mounted his famous 13-hour filibuster to John Brennan's nomination for CIA director. It's this double standard that motivated Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu to write a compelling letter to the New York Times in which he asked, "Do the United States and its people really want to tell those of us who live in the rest of the world that our lives are not of the same value as yours?" And that quote is on one of the posters out here in the hallway. When I read that letter, I said to myself, I want Archbishop Tutu to write the foreword to this book, which he did. And he elaborates on that sentiment in the book. Now, in 2013, Obama gave a speech to the National Defense University because international criticism was targeting his drone policy and the continued indefinite detention of men at Guantanamo, where they were starving themselves to death and the military guards were violently force feeding them. And Obama explained, the United States is at war with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and their associated forces. It didn't describe who those associated forces were. He defended his drone and targeted killing program, but he also said, America does not take strikes when we have the ability to capture individual terrorists. Our preference is always to detain, interrogate, and prosecute them. And then rules were issued that day. One of the rules, and I'm not going to go through all of them, just to show you how they're not even following their own rules, the target must pose a continuing imminent threat to U.S. persons. Now, the fact sheet that was released doesn't define continuing or imminent, but the recently leaked Department of Justice white paper says that a U.S. citizen can be killed even where there is no clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests will take place in the immediate future. So, what does imminent mean? The month before Obama gave his speech, oh boy, 3 minutes, okay. Okay. One of the contributors to this book is Jane Mayer, and in 2009, she interviewed Vicki Duvall, who was a CIA lawyer and now teaches at the Naval Academy. And Vicki Duvall told Jane Mayer, people are a lot more comfortable with a predator strike that kills many people than with a throat slitting that kills one. And sure enough, it's hideous when we hear about this. But we don't see the images, we don't hear the stories about the children who were blown to bits by the drones. If we did, Americans might feel very differently about even foreigners getting killed. I know many of you remember that iconic photograph of the 9-year-old girl running naked from a U.S. bomber in Vietnam, covered with napalm. That and other images like it had a lot to do with turning me very much against the Vietnam War and becoming a lifelong anti-war activist. And it wasn't an intellectual decision at all. I didn't read a bunch of books and then weigh all the merits and decide I was going to be against the war. It was a visceral reaction. And so we need to bring those stories and images to the American people. I want to tell you that the former Defense Intelligence Agency Director, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, said that Obama's drone program is counterproductive and it's a failed strategy. And in terms of just picking up on what Phyllis said about diplomacy in the UN Charter, which was enacted to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, mandates that peaceful solutions be pursued and that military force only be a last resort. A RAND study analyzed 268 terrorist groups worldwide between 1968 and 2006 and found that 43% ended through a peaceful political resolution with their government. 40% were penetrated and eliminated by local police and intelligence agencies, while only 7% were eliminated by military force. Drones and targeted killing will not solve the problem of terrorism. If you use the drone in the selected killings and do nothing on the other side, then you get rid of individuals. But the root causes are still there. The root causes are not security. The root causes are political and economic. And this is the former Somali foreign minister who told that to Jeremy Scahill. I'm almost done. A Pentagon study conducted during the Bush administration, this is a Pentagon study, concluded Muslims do not hate our freedom, rather they hate our policies. It identified American direct intervention in the Muslim world through the U.S.'s one-sided support in favor of Israel, support for Islamic tyrannical regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and primarily the American occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, which, although they're rationalized to stop terrorism, paradoxically elevate the stature and support for Islamic radicals. We ignore this admonition at our peril. Obama's focus on strikes has made it impossible for now to forge the new relationship with the Muslim world he had envisioned, according to Becker and Shane. Both Pakistan and Yemen are arguably less stable. Certainly, Yemen has been going through incredible instability with changes in government and, of course, stepped-up drone attacks. They're more hostile to the United States than when Obama became president. Justly or not, drones have become a provocative symbol of American power running roughshod over national sovereignty and killing innocents. Until we stop invading countries with Muslim populations, occupying their lands, torturing their people, and killing them with drones, we will never be safe from terrorism. Thank you.
Marjorie, thank you very much. So we've heard two tremendous, informative presentations about the Middle East, and now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to go to the Ukraine and current standoff, eyeball to eyeball, U.S., Russia. How did this happen, and what can we do to extract ourselves out of this? The two powerful nuclear nations looking at each other, and we got to get out of that somehow. But to help us understand that, how we got here, how we're going to get out, Ray McGovern.
I can't tell you what an honor it is to follow these two compañeras of mine. Talk about prophets. You've got it right here, these two. And I noticed that not one of you took a wink or even a little nod or anything. But I'm afraid what's going to happen when I speak. So how about just 1 minute, really? Get up, stretch, stay awake. I see if I can get this thing going. We Irish like to talk forever, so I always have to have my watch here before Barry gives me the hook. I can't tell you what it is to look out at you all. How can you possibly be in despair? You know, I would just ask you, everyone, turn around, look at the group that you're with. I mean, with companions like this, how can we fail? Well, I'd like to do a little bit about Ukraine, but it needs some context, and it needs to really go back to the end of World War II, which I lived through as a young lad. I was born 1 week before Hitler invaded Poland. I was in existence for the whole time. It was the grist of my boyhood, and I've studied a bit about World War II. So let me just say that after World War II, we emerged as the sole indispensable country in the world, or in the universe, or wherever we were in, right? Okay. We had won, okay? We had not been destroyed, and so we had to do a policy. And George Kennan, who was my hero, up until I learned what his policy was, he wrote the first policy document of the Policy Planning Council of the State Department, and it said, we account for about 6% of the world's population, and we control about 50% of the world's wealth.
Speak into the mic.
Yeah, okay. We control about 50% of the world's wealth. And so our policy needs to be devised as to make sure that we keep this disproportionate amount of wealth for ourselves. And, you know, we can't be deceived by platitudes like human rights, for Pete's sake. It's going to come to a hard force, okay? Wow, George Kennan, 48, okay? Now, if you fast forward here, you'll see that in 2015, George, wow, what's the difference? Barack Obama, sorry about that. Barack Obama is saying the same thing. We are the sole indispensable country in the world. Don't you forget it. And those who say that we're declining, they don't know what they're talking about. Well, they do know what they're talking about. And I'd like to quote a very astute political observer, whom I sort of grew up with. His name is Yogi Berra. And he said, you know, the future is not like what it used to be. So there we are. Now, I'd like to fast forward to what really happened in Ukraine, and you really go back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, when once again we became the sole indispensable country in the world, right? Because the Soviet Union fell apart. Now, when I talk at universities, I usually say, all right, who knows what a synonym is? And most of the kids never did. They're like, now, well, how about an antonym? And maybe I get 2 or 3, okay? So I say, what's the antonym for indispensable? Dispensable? Well, yeah. So that, by definition, means all the other countries are dispensable. Do the other countries realize that? Yeah, straight. Do they like it? Not very much. Okay. So that's the kind of the attitude here, and we decided that after the Berlin Wall, and it took a little while. In other words, President George H.W. Bush did a couple of good things. I'm a little prejudiced because I used to brief him every other morning. He was the most fun person to brief in the whole world. He had a terrific sense of humor. It wasn't until later that I learned about his involvement in Iran-Contra and everything else. Okay. So anyhow, When the Berlin Wall fell, he immediately called Gorbachev, and he said, look, Mikhail, we're not going to take advantage of this. Sorry for your troubles. And Gorbachev said, what? No, we're not going to. Look, let's get together here, you know. We're talking November 10th, 11th, something like that. Let's get together right away so we can prevent this from turning out in a bad way. How soon could you come to? Well, Malta. How about Malta? That's sort of halfway. And Khrushchev said, well, okay. They had a summit in Malta in December. So 1 month after, actually 3 weeks after the Berlin Wall fell. And Bush said, look, you know, my vision is a Europe from Portugal to Vladivostok, okay? We need one kind of Europe that is coalesced, and we're not going to take advantage of this. So I'm going to send my Secretary of State, James Baker, to Moscow. How soon could you receive him? As soon as possible. Okay, February comes. And Baker says, look, what we need from you is acquiescence in a united Germany. And Gorbachev said, what? I said, what? That was the policy of all European countries and our own policy. You keep Germany divided for obvious reasons, or for reasons that should be obvious to all people my age, and many people who study history. Well, it was a hard thing to swallow. How many people did the Soviet Union lose in World War II to the Germans? How many?
20 million.
25 million is the best guess. 25 million people? That's more than all the other combatants and non-combatants lost in the whole war. So, you know, they weren't real keen on a reunited Germany. But Jim Baker was a pretty persuasive guy, and he said, okay, look, we're going to put it in NATO. That way they won't get their own nuclear potential. We'll keep track of it. And in return, we won't move NATO 1 inch to the east.
Wow.
Whoa. Well, you know what happened, right? NATO doubled in size. Bill Clinton thought it would be a really neat idea to, you know. And I asked one of Gorbachev's principal advisors, his name is Guvaldi. I was in Moscow two years ago. And I said, well, why wasn't that written down, that promise, you know? A lot of people ask, you know, why isn't it written down? And he said, well, you know, it was a little premature because the Warsaw Pact still existed, but the big thing was, and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, we trusted you. Wow. I want to fast forward here a little bit. 2008 became a really important year. In January, there were lots of rumors that Ukraine and Georgia would be invited into NATO. Okay? So what happens? Sergei Lavrov, who was about the most astute diplomat I've ever known. He was foreign minister of Russia at the time. He's still foreign minister. Okay. He called Bill Burns, our ambassador, in, and he said, now, Mr. Ambassador, do you know what "niet" means? You know, I think so. He said, well, "niet" means "niet," and that means do not even think about incorporating Ukraine into NATO. Now, how do I know that? Chelsea Manning. It was in the cables. If I've read one Moscow cable, as Anne Wright has, you know what that looked like, and they were the real thing. And this is I have to give it to Bill Burns. He titled it "Niet means niet." Russia's red line on Ukraine. Hello? 2nd of February, 2008. Now, I want to show you what happened exactly a month later. So if someone can get the lights, if I can get this thing going here.
On Russia, this is
Bill Bradley.
terribly sad thing for me, because I spent a lot of time in the 80s and early 90s on Russia. I'd go there every year, I'd spend weeks there, I traveled all over. I got to know most of the people who ran the government and who are now there. And I think that right now we're confronted with something that potentially could have been avoided. And the fundamental blunder that the United States made in the mid-'80s, late '80s, early '90s, was the extension of NATO. I mean, here we'd won the Cold War. We'd won the Cold War. And you then had people saying, well, now...
Do you? Sorry. That, I think you have it on the wrong computer. I mean, I can try to set it up for you. Listen to it.
No, this is my computer.
Right.
It had it all set up, you know. So, okay, that's Bill Bradley, in a word, ruining what he watched happen. Now, you know, I think he's already said, he studied what happened in the Soviet Union. He studied Russian history at Oxford. He was a Rhodes Scholar, like that fellow Clinton. Okay, and so he knew which end was up, and he knew that this was a tragic mistake. And here he is, kind of in March, so 1 month after Lavrov called in Burns. He said, "This is really a tragedy because none of this has to happen. Why the hell did we have to move NATO into Russia's border?" Okay. Well, the next month, so we're talking February, March. March is Bradley. What's after March? April. April 2nd in Bucharest, NATO summit. Declaration. Ukraine, the Ukraine we used to call it those days, and Georgia shall become members of NATO. 2008. So talk about, you know, the one indispensable country in the world, the hubris and arrogance. We don't care what Lavrov said, because what had been shown, and this is interesting, since 1991, when we did Desert Shield and Desert Storm, was, in the words of Paul Wolfowitz to General Clark, he said, what we learned, the big lesson from that is the Russians can't do anything. Okay? The Russians won't do anything. Now, I never thought that I would be yearning for the reestablishment of the Soviet Union, where they would deter us from stuff like that, but that Soviet Union had fallen, and the Russians can't do anything, and that was our attitude right up till now. Now, what about now? I was at a meeting of a bunch of progressive people, very progressive people, and they had a guest speaker. She was a professor from one of the universities in Washington. And she said, you know, I have to tell you a story. My son, who was only 11, he came back from Sunday school, and he had done this wonderful, wonderful placard. And he said, Mr. Pucci, have you not heard, thou shalt not kill? And so I looked around the room, and most of my progressive friends were saying, oh, so I, you know, raised my hand. Always the skunk at the picnic. What are you referring to? She said, well, Crimea, of course, Crimea. I said, well, how many people were killed there? Oh, probably, well, hundreds, at least thousands. I said, would you believe 0? And all my friends said, they didn't know. That was the cleverest operation I've ever watched. The Russians already had 30,000 troops in there by treaty, and they just went around to the important places and what they call these vежливые люди, these polite people, okay? And you can get a mug in Moscow now that says vежливые люди with, you know, these guys that dressed up in black, and on the other side is самый вежливый из людей, the most polite of all people, and there's a picture of Putin. They're very proud of him. They know what happened. He didn't brag about it. So let me use up the next part of my thing here is simply this, that it wasn't 13 letters. It was my 1,013th letter. But the Washington Post actually published a letter. It was, what was it? July 1st, actually. It was on what McCain had said. McCain had said, Putin annexed Crimea without provocation. The Washington Post had a big thing on March 10th. It said, Putin had early plans to annex Crimea. There was a secret meeting Mr. Putin held on February 23, 2014, during which Russia decided it would take the Crimean Peninsula. Okay. Is that true? Yeah, it's true. Is it missing something? What's it missing? Huh? I'll read it again. On 23 February, Putin convened his folks, and they decided what to do about Crimea. What happened the day before? The day before is what George Friedman, no slouch he, has called the most blatant coup in the history of mankind. It was advertised, they say the revolution will not be televised, but this coup was YouTubeized 2.5 weeks before it happened. Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland telling our ambassador in Ukraine what they're going to do, who they're going to pick. Yats is the guy. Yats. Who is Yats? Yatsenyuk. So he became immediately the prime minister. And who's prime minister now? Do you know? Yats. Yats. Yeah. I wrote an article the next day. Yikes! It's Yats. I thought maybe, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind would have prevented Yats from being a prime minister since he was YouTubeized, but no, that doesn't work. So what do? I think that we have to do more than make speeches and op-eds and stuff like that. I remember Cesar Chavez. He used to say, hey, thanks a lot for the speeches, thanks a lot, they were really great op-eds, but without action, nothing happens, okay? And people would say, says Cesar, there aren't enough of us. And I would say, says Cesar, there are enough of us. There are already enough of us, and there are enough of us here right in this room. What we need to do is do some action. Now, Colleen Rowley and I are going to do that by touring Iowa. I think I know where that is. It's sort of west of Patterson, and we're going to be there for a whole week at the end of September. And the idea there is just to kind of, well, I call it the circus cleanup brigade after elephants and donkeys. But this is a vital function, I think, and Colleen and I have a little bit of credibility, at least among those people who know who we are. Dr. King said this in his famous letter to the from the Birmingham City Jail. He said, like a boil, that can never be cured while it is covered up, but must be opened with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. So too, injustice must be exposed with all the tensions that its exposure creates to the air of human conscience and the light of national opinion before it can be dealt with. So, to those of you who have been following and know for example, that when the Washington Post says, aha, see, Putin admits now that he was going to seize Crimea, and they had a planning meeting on the 23rd of February, months before it was seized. Well, you have to know that on the 22nd it was the coup, okay? And if I were Putin, I would have done exactly the same thing. That's where the naval port is. That's where they couldn't let the U.S. come in there and build a naval port. So what you need to do is know what to do. And then the other thing I'd say is, one of my heroes is Daniel Berrigan. And I had a chance to see him about 15 months ago up at Fordham University. He's with an infirmary where they take care of Jesuits who are sick. And I told him I was going to see Ed Snowden. I said, did he have any word for him? And he's not, he's very alert. He's got a pile of books he's reading, but he looked at me and he says, yeah, tell him he did the right thing. And I said, Dan Ellsberg, you're our mutual friend. He gives his best. I talked to Dan, so I told him I was going to. He says, tell him he did the right thing too. So what we need to do is figure out what the right thing to do is, okay? And I'm going to close here by citing what Phil and his brother, Dan and his brother Phil and the others did there. It was 47 years ago now, and it was at Keatonsville in Maryland. Now, after it was all over, this was really the biggest, where they got napalm, burned draft cards, and waited to be arrested. So they're waiting in the only federal building in Keatonsville, Maryland, which is the post office, right? So Dan explains, I came across a precious thought. I didn't know whether this was worth doing. And he said, success or efficiency, they were placed in the background where they belong. They're not irrelevant, but they're not central. One had very little to go on. Still, a little went a long way. The act was let go. Its truth and goodness were entrusted to the four winds. Indeed, good consequences were a small matter to me compared with the integrity of the action. The need responded to, the spirits lifted, and that lifts my spirit. Perhaps it does for you too. The more recent prophets and activists that I've known, and there are three of them right up here next to me here, they've been able to do this, but only by keeping their sense of humor, okay? This is essential. If you're going to be in this business, and especially if you're going to put success where it belongs, not irrelevant, but not essential, okay? Then you need a sense of humor. And Dan Dan is a poet, right? And this is the last thing I'll say. He's sitting there in the post office, and his brother Phil, also a priest, sitting over there. And they're kind of reviewing what they did, and in comes what Dan calls a judge-jawed FBI inspector. Comes into the room, and he looks at my brother Phil, and he says, you again! I'm gonna change my religion. and Dan says, no higher compliment could ever come to my brother Phil. So keep your sense of humor, but let's figure out things to do where you need to put your body into it, because speech is not bad to do fine. But as Art Laughlin told me the day before I got arrested the first time, Ray, sometimes you have to put your body into it. Oh, one last thing. When I turned my back on Hillary Clinton. We're in discovery about that right now. We're in discovery 4.5 years later. I guess they hope to die or something. We're in discovery. Okay. The big thing I learned from that was this. Hillary Clinton, partly because of what you guys did, right? Put the word out. She got thousands and thousands of emails and telephone calls. You know why? Because you don't beat up a 72-year-old man. Young kids, they have it coming to them, right? Somebody with this kind of hair, okay? So, lesson here, lesson. We have many of us have a really real advantage, okay? They're not going to kill you, I don't think. But, if you get beat up a little bit, people care about what happens to old people. So put that into play. Thank you very much.
Great panel, huh? Okay, so we'll have some time for some questions, but because time is, we don't have a lot of it. So please, we're not so much interested in comments, but questions. This is Q&A, so try to be short with your question. Let's get as many as we can in the next few minutes or so. So we'll start here.
Okay. Ray, I call the Putin policy the Monroevich policy. Based